let me just start by paying tribute to Mary Jean, because when Mary Jean was Director of Education in Windsor, she was instrumental in starting up the Arabic English bilingual program, which has been very, very successful, as she mentioned. And it's one of the few examples of linguistic imagination that we can point to in Ontario over the last 40 years. And as she also said, she worked as in a senior position in the Ministry of Education and shepherded in a lot of very exemplary, very enlightened educational programs in general. But this was in a context of laws in Ontario that prohibit any kind of imaginative bilingual programs other than those in English and French, with one or two exceptions. I travel to the United States quite frequently and also to other countries, and I frequently have conversations that go along these kinds of lines. Some people will say, okay, you're so advanced up in Canada, you've got all of these bilingual programs, you've been reading about the French immersion programs, and things are so controversial in the States, I wish we could be like Canada. And then they'll ask a question, well, what languages do you have bilingual programs in? And I have to say that there's only really one province, with Manitoba and Saskatchewan to a certain extent, there's only one province that has any kind of enlightened language policy in Canada. And that happens to be, ironically, the most conservative province, or the province that we've thought of as being most conservative, at least until recently. We're the 50-50 programs in Alberta, starting off in the Edmonton Public Board, started off in 1974 with the Ukrainian English program, which was followed a couple of years later by the German English, and then, as Lisa has told us, the Mandarin program came in the early 1980s. I was around when these programs started, my supervisor, I was doing my PhD at the University of Alberta, my supervisor was from Ukrainian background. He was very much involved in providing advice about these programs. And so I can point to them with some degree of national Canadian pride. But I feel intensely embarrassed to have to say to my American friends and friends in Europe and elsewhere that no, we have laws in Ontario that prohibit the use of any language other than English and French as mediums of instruction, except on a short-term transitional basis, and which in some cases, as Mary Jean has pointed out, can be stretched, but we operate in a linguistic straitjacket that is absolutely unacceptable. We're in a situation where if we look to the States, and again, Lisa has been very articulate in this, we see all kinds of imaginative language programs, bilingual programs, immersion programs involving obviously Spanish, but also Korean, Japanese, Chinese, Mandarin, and yet none of that is possible in Ontario. Now, when we look at the rationale behind the Education Act and behind the prohibition of instruction through languages other than English and French, we don't see very much basis there. I've got a handout which I'll pass around, or can be passed around later, but one of the sheets on it is a summary of some of the things that the Royal Commission on Learning reported back in, when they reported back in 1994. This was a commission co-chaired by Monique Bejean and Jerry Kaplan. It was set up by the NDP government at the time, so one might have expected it to be somewhat progressive. And they made the point that when they were preparing their report, which was a general survey of education in Ontario, and it was mandated to articulate directions for improving education and directions for the future. They made the point that they got a lot of submissions from various people in the community and from academics like myself and others, arguing for a change in the Education Act so that other languages could be used as mediums of instruction, like in Alberta. And I'm not going to read what's here, but they basically said, no, we don't support that, because we're very concerned that all students in Ontario be truly literate in one of the official languages. In other words, they're basically saying that if there's a bilingual program involving a language other than English and French, this will undermine students' literacy development in English. This is the height of irresponsible intellectual laziness. All they had to do was to look at the programs in Alberta, programs across Canada, programs in the United States, programs everywhere, that shows that children in bilingual programs, regardless of the language, do not lose out in terms of their academic development in the majority language. So they raise that scare, and then they say, we support the existing heritage language or international language program, but we're not prepared to go well beyond that by suggesting that students be educated in an immersion or bilingual program in any one of a vast number of non-official languages. So they raise the specter of total balkanization and fracturing of the education system. Again, there's no evidence for that. The challenges of setting up any kind of bilingual program for a community, getting community support, getting the schools, are very, they're immense. So when we look at Alberta, we see, I think it's about 12 languages that they have programs in at this point, but there's no likelihood that there's going to be more than a handful of programs, at least in the early years, in Ontario. And so what we see here is the one mention that I know of where this issue has been raised in a formal way at the policy level shows an absolute lack of either awareness or interest in the research. It's a totally ideological response, and I would have expected somebody like Jerry Kaplan to have a little bit more insight and awareness of the research on this issue. So when we look at what the future holds and how we move forward on this, first of all, as Mary Jean said, there's a vast body of research out there supporting this direction. What we know from more than 200 studies carried out over the last 50 years on the effects of bilingualism on children's development is that there's a lot of evidence supporting the fact that bilinguals have more what they call attentional control, so they can focus their attention more. They develop better awareness of how language works. They're better at learning additional languages. And there's a variety of other effects that some studies point to. One of the ones that's particularly interesting for people at my stage of life is one that highlights the fact that bilingualism and multilingualism seems to inhibit dementia. Okay, I'm serious. I had to look twice when I started to read these studies. But the research carried out by Ellen Bialystok of York University and by a variety of researchers since then in places like India and elsewhere have shown that there's about a 4 to 5 year delay in the onset of dementia among bilinguals as compared to monolinguals. So they compared elderly people who were showing symptoms or had been diagnosed with early signs of dementia, and then looked at who was bilingual, who was monolingual, and they found that there was a very significant gap in terms of the onset of these symptoms. And that suggests that, as many people have suggested, our brains are like muscles. The more we use them, the more they develop, and the healthier they stay. We also know, so in addition to the cognitive and academic benefits of bilingualism and multilingualism, we know from a vast amount of research that children educated in a bilingual program, whether it's a 50-50 program like the ones in Edmonton and Alberta, or more full immersion type programs like the French immersion programs, we know that students transfer what they're learning in the minority language to the dominant language. They transfer the concepts that they're learning, they transfer a variety of learning skills from one language to another. And this is why there's, in the vast number, thousands of bilingual programs that have been evaluated, they are totally consistent in showing no academic loss or no language loss in either subjects taught through the minority language or as a result of spending less time in the majority language. in the evaluation that colleagues of mine and I did on the Arabic language program in Windsor, we found that there was some indications that students in the program were showing stronger vocabulary development in English than the comparison group. It wasn't a very big sample, but it's that kind of result that's coming up over and over again in evaluations of bilingual programs. So where do we go from here? I think, as I've said, this is the Ministry's position. The Education Act is an ideological, at least in respect to this, is ideological rather than evidence-based. Nobody in the Ministry, I'm sure, would be foolish enough to try and defend its provisions at this point, because the kind of defense or the kinds of arguments that people like Monique Bejean and Jerry Kaplan gave 20 years ago are totally spurious. And so what we need to do is to let them hear our voices, because since it's a political issue, they need to know that there is very little political risk involved with this. There are many people in the business community who would strongly support this and who have argued for better teaching of languages like Mandarin for obvious reasons. And so we need to create political pressure, back up that pressure with the research evidence, and demand conversation, demand dialogue on these issues. As I said, the only dialogue, partial dialogue, on this issue over the last 40 years since I've been in Toronto that I can remember is the Royal Commission on Learning. And that wasn't particularly dialogical. It was one-way decisions, evidence-free decisions. So thank you, Stephen, for the initiative in bringing this group together, you and your committee. And I'm really happy to be part of it and to support the directions that I hope will follow.